There we go. And we're off. Well, folks, welcome back to another Water Stories webinar. It's Sustainable Design Class webinar. I'm very grateful for the folks who are joining us again and for the folks who are joining us for the first time. If this is your first webinar, the format we're going to do is we're going to give a little intro. Minnie's going to present her presentations from all the projects he's done across the world. And then we're going to go into Q&A at the end. And so if you have burning questions, make sure to keep them for the Q&A. It's not going to be a really super long presentation, so there's going to be plenty of time to get your questions answered. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you guys the place where you want to ask your questions. So instead of doing it on Zoom, there's the community that we have is called Water Stories. So I'm going to put this link in the chat box. And
I can do that for you, Raleigh, too.
I got confused by Zoom. I should be a master. But basically, Zach's going to post the link in there. It's waterstories.app/community. You'll click on join us. And, there'll be a kind of, if it's first time, there's a link that you'll input your email, a username, and a password, and then it will send you an invite over email. And then once you're part of the community, there's a thread called Water Restorations where you'll be able to ask your questions with Minnie. So questions for Minnie will go here, and that way we'll be able to get your response first up. So for example, Steve asked his questions for Minnie, and we're gonna answer starting on the thread. And then if there's more time, we'll switch to answering questions on Zoom. But this is where it's going to live. This is where the whole webinar is going to live for all time, is on the Water Stories community. Zach, is there anything else you'd want to share on that, or is that?
Yeah, just that we will also do a couple of live questions. If people want to ask their questions live on the call, we'll do those first. And then when people want to type their questions, please post them on the Water Stories thread. Because the other piece of this is building a long-term library of resources. So when we answer these questions, the video snippets will also go on the thread so that someone 6 months or a year down the road, when they have the same question, they can just type it into Google and find this resource. So that's why we're doing it that way.
Nice. Well, I'm going to leave that up for a minute just for the folks who are joining us. So yeah, we've got definitely want to flood in here. Join us and join the water restoration community, because there's a lot of exciting things in here. People sharing their own projects from across the world on how they're restoring water systems, whether that's on farms, on landscapes, in communities, on a homestead. It doesn't matter the scale. These are people with decentralized water retention projects in action. And it's really inspiring to see this community grow. And without further ado, how about let's get started, everybody. I was really glad to organize this webinar with Minnie Gain and with Zach, because it just shows it shows examples of communities who don't have a lot of resources, but are still able to have enormous impact where they are on the water cycle. And it's no secret that we are in the middle of a global emergency in terms of ecosystems and climate. It doesn't matter if you're the northern hemisphere, the southern. It's record heat, it's record drought, it's wildfire everywhere you go, or it's extreme flooding. We're in the middle of a total climate and ecosystem upheaval. And so it's an emergency to find solutions to where we can make an impact to stabilize our climate and our ecosystems as rapidly as possible. And now, while we're waiting for these large-scale government solutions, our governments are feuding with each other. They're totally inactive. They're toothless to kind of engage in a lot of these problems. So we have to search out solutions where communities were able to restore ecosystems effectively on their own, because we can't wait. We can't wait for billionaires or the government to step up when there's ways that we could organize it ourselves. And so this is why it's really important to share example of Minnie's work with Flow Partnership, because she's at the spearhead of organizing and helping carry out these decentralized water restoration projects all across the world. And these are communities who have almost no resources. in Rajasthan where there's almost no rainfall, and yet they're able to establish decentralized water restoration projects where they are. And it goes without saying that there's nowhere to run at Safe Place unless we restore our ecosystems. And so building decentralized water retention projects is the way that we will be able to stabilize our climate and establish safety. Like, this is one of the most effective ways that we can secure our future in going forward. So I'm really grateful to bring on Minnie and share, and bring on Zach yet again, working together on water stories, and share with you guys water restoration projects in action. So we got a little video to show you about Minnie's work. And this is a story about how water retention projects help save a community in Rajasthan. And this is a video called Water for All. So I'm going to switch to there, and we're going to share a little snippet of the video. All right, show this little video. We're going to show a little minute here. So Zach, can you see that all right?
Yep.
Hear it?
Yep,
Okay,
we see
great.
it and hear it. Yep.
जब धरती के पेट में पानी रहता है तो फिर हम कभी भी अकाल या सूखा है तो मर्यादित होकर उससे अपना जीवन चला सकते हैं।
ये तालाब नहीं बने हो या पहले मतलब सूखी खेती रही थी, कोसी पूरी बस्ती में कुछ भी नहीं होता।
जो महाराजपुरा में जो तालाब बना है, इससे गांव का ही जल स्तर नहीं, आसपास के 3-4 गांव है उनका भी जल स्तर ऊंचा उठा है। अच्छा। और उन लोगों ने भी इस कोरोना के समय में अपने गांवों में फसल की है, वो फसल की देन इसी तालाब की है। अच्छा। हाँ, बिल्कुल आत्मनिर्भर हुए हैं इस तालाब से, पूरा गांव आत्मनिर्भर हुआ है। क्या बात है, सही सही।
और कुआ मतलब खेचू तम जो इसके नीचे बोर हैं, 22 कुआं सब अटूट है गए।
फल भरे नहीं जाना पड़ेगा साहब, जो पैदावारी होगी हमको पानी से, तो पैदावारी होगी तो हम कहीं जाएंगे, हमको तो आज से बहुत सुविधा हुई।
2 महीना पानी दी तो फिर नावे पानी दी तो 12 मास नहावत हैं।
Cool. So that's an excellent Flow partnership video called Water for All. We're going to send you guys the link, and after this webinar, definitely check that out. It's a great 7-minute video about how Minnie's Flow partnership work in Rajasthan helped restore a community's water systems in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. So it's an inspiring story. It's done by a filmmaker called Ashok Meena. So definitely check that out. Without further ado, I'm going to let Zach, why don't you introduce Minnie, and let's get this webinar started.
Yeah, it's really my pleasure to introduce you all to Minnie Jane. Minnie and I, we first connected several years ago now. And I remember the first call, there was just such a wonderful feeling of connection where at the end of an hour-long Zoom call, I felt like I had known this person half of my life. And she's just so warm, so caring, but also really action-oriented and really pushes things forward. And first and foremost focuses on the health and well-being of the community. And that really showed firsthand when she then invited me to see some of Flow Partnership's projects, and to see this village that was out of options. They were down to 9 hectares of agriculture. And then after this Johad, they had more than 650 hectares of agriculture. They paid for the cost of the Johad 4 times over the first year in the increase in agricultural productivity. And it's all these communities taking power back for themselves. And that's what I think is really so powerful about this. And so without further ado, Minnie, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Rolly. It's very kind of you to give me such a lovely introduction. But the reality is, of course, that we all do this work together. And it is community, what I call community-driven decentralized water management. And the communities are across the world, whether they live in rural, dry, arid Rajasthan, India, or they live in completely dry. We are doing another project in Colombia, seeing whether can be a transfer of knowledge from the work in Rajasthan, or it can be an urban community in the heart of Delhi, which could potentially translate to something in the heart of Mexico. So the work is enormous. The challenges are enormous, but the community's willingness, and that's the harness and that's the inspiration that gets this work happening. So let me just quickly put on my PowerPoint. I wonder what we did before computers and PowerPoints. So we were discussing what really, amongst all the work that we do, what are the main words that come out to us? What happens when you do community-driven decentralized water management?
Sorry, excuse me, Minnie. Is your screen being shared, or have you yet to share that?
It's not sharing, is it? Hold on a
yeah,
minute.
it hasn't shared yet. So folks,
I'll
if
do
you're,
it again.
let us know if she's sharing the screen. Yeah, no problem.
I probably didn't press the share button. There we are.
There we go. Boom. There we go. Now we're in action.
Thank you. Technology can fox all of us at the right time. Yes, so to come back to what I started with is, what are the words that jump out at us in this work? When you do this community-driven decentralized water management, what happens? I mean, first is that it's decentralized, the community does it. And for me, that's a really crucial word, that we don't do it for the community. It is not top down, it's not even horizontal, it's not even bottom up. It's all of us shared together, and then something happens. But the most important thing in community-driven decentralized management is that there is a self-reliance. You heard the chap in the film, he said that Atmanirbhar, we've become self-reliant. And for me, that is crucial. When a community becomes self-reliant, it's not dependent on aid, it's not dependent on somebody to come and tell you how to turn on the tap or turn on the particular gizmo that gives them XYZ. When they know what to do, we've taken care of all life's, whatever life throws at us, we've taken care of our ability to deal with that. So from those are the words that I really like to keep in front whenever we work, whichever project we work, whoever we work with. And there are so many heroes across the world who inspire us to spread this work more and more. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So it's reversing drought, reversing floods, reversing migration with water cycle restoration. So that's a really interesting word. Can we do all that with water cycle restoration? Well, we'll see. Let's have a look in a bit in some of the work that I might show you. I put these words at the bottom, right at the bottom. When a drought or flood comes, it doesn't look at whether you're rich or poor. It eventually takes everyone in its grip. So those are powerful words said by one of my heroes, Rajendra Singh in India, who's also called the Waterman of India. And you'll meet him in a minute. It's such a thing to keep in mind. It doesn't matter we're a billionaire jetting off to space, or we're this very poor person because of COVID doesn't have food to eat. Eventually, if the earth dries up, if the water cycle goes out of whack, if we've shoved in so much carbon in the atmosphere that life on earth is unsustainable, how much money is going to save you? None. So it will take everybody in its grip. So that's good to keep in mind. It's a shared challenge. The challenge is not just belonging to X community to take care of. It's ours. Next few slides, I'll quickly give you the bad news. So it's usually good to just get thoroughly depressed, and then then we can say, oh, phew, there are solutions. The biggest challenge is climate change. It is now visible more and more and more, and I don't need to say anything further about it, but it is driven. A lot of climate change is evident or expressed in the way the water cycle goes out of whack, or we've got so much carbon going in there. There's so much drought and so much flood. What's very interesting at the moment we find is till recently, all the flood or drought stories were coming out of India, Indonesia, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and all the supposedly developing world. But now all these natural disaster stories are beginning to come out of Canada, USA, Germany, Europe. So it's now becoming a shared challenge, visible as a shared challenge. Till now, it wasn't visible as a shared challenge. So this is all really, look at the water risk. You can see so many countries going from having ample water to actually, the red bits are really, if there's a huge water risk, we've taken out so much groundwater. What's happening? We've got eroding soils, we've got more desertification. And I don't actually even need to say this. It is, since I know all of us who are here on this webinar will already have noticed these and seen them in varying degrees. Look at the kind of population explosion. How are we going to feed everybody if we already have taken out so much of the groundwater, especially if we live in cities and we're concentrated in the cities? We don't see what's happening in the rural areas. And yet, if there's no rural resilience, there's no urban resilience. We have to focus on where our water systems are and how we use them where we live. So these are things which we really have to keep in mind. What is the farming system? Where do we buy our food? The food that we buy, is it farmed in a sustainable manner? Is it looking after the earth as well as the human beings who are farming it? And then the food which comes out of something that has been produced with care nourishes us and allows us to live in harmony with all the gifts that nature has for us. So those are things which we keep in mind. And then if you pump out the water, how are you going to produce the food? I mean, the aquifers across the world, major aquifers in the world, we've now, with all our technology and our very powerful machines, we've been able to almost pump half those aquifers dry. How are we going to replenish them? The rate of replenishment has to accelerate. How are we going to do that? Are we going to be able to do that? And of course, big solutions have their place. Of course, very much. You can't say that it'll only be there's no one solution. But with challenges like COVID-19 coming, I mean, a common one is everybody says, oh yeah, you wash your hands for 20 seconds, sing happy birthday while you do that, and wash your hands every time you come back. But what about communities who have COVID and don't have water? How can they wash their hands? Never mind the rest of, water for food, for living, for drinking, for the animals. So of course that then leads to migration. So that's the scenario that we are increasing in our world. And how can we decrease it? Is there a way to decrease it? So these are all links which you can actually look into later. We've got various story maps around that. So the links will be there. But really embedding where the problem is and how the solution to that can happen, and how are all these problems linked to the water cycle. I mean, that's a question I get often from people. Yeah, of course, but the problem is migration. The problem is poverty. But if you keep peeling back each layer, finally it comes back to water. Without water, there is no life. And when there is water, life returns and all the various other problems get taken care of. So is there something you and I, these problems, it sounds like a huge global problem. At our level, can we do something? And then not just our level, it's a question of those rural communities that live in the poorest part of the world. Do they have the wherewithal to do something? Another question I get is, are they clever enough to do anything? And I'm really happy to report they're cleverer than us, for sure. They know what to do. And all our job is to enable them to do what they know. I put this slide in because I always love to be reminded what the water cycle is and how the water from the ground goes up into the atmosphere and comes back to us. And the water cycle and the life cycle are then one. And that this reminder to us then, gives us an understanding of this beautiful planet, blue planet that we live in. So after all that bad news, here's some really good news. We've each of us been given a free bank account. Did anybody tell you that? Maybe, maybe not. And the free bank account is in the World Water Bank. So what is the World Water Bank? And we really thought about this and thought, if water gives us life, surely that's our wealth. Surely that's our biggest wealth. And so, of course, the water is held in the banks, in the earth. And that understanding of water being our real wealth is if we understood that's what gives us life, not the gold coins piled up in your bank, the man-made bank account. It's if you have water in your bank, then you have a life. If you have money in your money bank account but no water, which one would you rather prefer? If you're really thirsty, which one is going to keep you alive? So with this understanding that real wealth is our water, in the water banks of the earth. And those are the banks. That's the bank we need to look after. That's the bank we need to keep healthy. That's the bank we need to keep replenished and topped up. And if we do that, each one of us, if we are able to do that, then of course we are a long way in having a healthier and more harmonious life. And then whatever happens with climate change, because these are huge systems going out of whack, not just because of human induced, but also that is the way systems work, then we can deal with what comes out from those, what's thrown at us from those systems. So I like to say that the Flow Partnership, the work of the Flow Partnership started with the work that I'll show you in India. But now we work with communities and facilitating the communities across the world to share, to do their secrets, their methods, their small, non-technological, very simple methods of replenishing and building their own water banks. So the question, of course, is how does your water bank become rich? And one of the best ways to make your water bank rich is hold the water as it's falling from the sky. Hold it in your landscape. And when you do that, you can do that with your communities. You can do that individually. You build ponds. You build structures that can hold that water. And when you do that, it does two things. In a dry area, the water goes down, percolates down into the underground aquifer and recharges it, and slowly the surface water and the underground aquifer ensure there's greenery. You saw that in the clip. And if it's a flooded area, the same intervention, and you hold the water, and it allows you to channel the water away from the very flooded section to maybe where there's lesser water. And if you hold it upstream, it stops that momentum of water gathering and flooding the community downstream. So that's really interesting. Two sides of the same coin. Floods and droughts are two sides of the same coin. And the same interventions can actually be useful for both. So here's my first hero of the day, Rajendra Singh, Waterman of India. He's a very well-known conservationist, and he's my brother. So he's like, we may not have been born in the same family, but we're absolutely in the same family of the heart. And my inspiration, my colleagues' inspiration, and it comes from the amazing work Rajendra started 30 years ago. And I'll tell you a little bit of his story, but as we go along, it's such a powerful story. And this has now become something which I find increasingly in different countries of the world. So very quickly, it's 1985. That was the kind of land Rajendra, was in. He was actually in Delhi. He's an Ayurvedic doctor, and he was in Delhi, and he really felt he should give medicine to the villages in India. And he and some of his pals and chums said, right, I'll give education, you give medicine, let's go. And they got onto the bus. They took the bus to the last end of the road. And 2 days later, they got off in this village, young men, beards, looking very, very frightening to all the old people who were, it was a very poor part. And they wondered, what are these terrorists coming here to do? We've got nothing to eat. What are we going to give them? But as in India, we prize hospitality. So they gave them room in the temple courtyard and said, we'll talk tomorrow. I'll tell you the rest of the story in a minute. However, what I want you to keep in mind is this picture in the corner that you see over here. Just keep it in your mind and we'll see what happens later. So, well, that's the map of India telling you how water stressed India is. Actually, I think it's even more than 54%. This is not the absolute latest figure. This was about 3 years ago. And so Rajendra went from Delhi, which is somewhere here. He got in that bus with his mates. He went to Rajasthan, which is the state here. And then he went to this area, which is near Jaipur, which is about 4 hours from Jaipur, a little village called Gopalpura. And that's where they stopped. It took them 2 full days to reach there. And then they started, walking around and telling the villagers the next morning, look, we've come here to give you medicine. We've come here to give you education. Your children should be in school. You should be studying. Finally, they were very patient, the villagers. Finally, one of them said, look, can't you see what we really need? We don't need your medicine and your education. If we had money, we could get those in the market. Don't you see what we need? We don't have any water. We don't have any food. Give us water. So he said, no, I'm not a civil engineer. How can I give you water? It's not possible. I don't know what to do. So they said, no, think about it. And as he was walking along, I mean, actually prior to that, his friends said these villages are hopeless. Whatever you give them, they don't want. 3 of them went back and only Rajendra remained. But he kept thinking of this question that the villagers had asked, give us water. And as he was walking along the next one of these days, he met man father. I'm sorry, there's no picture of this man, but he looked very much like him, very good physical resemblance there. And the old man said to him, look, you've got a good heart. And if you really, I understand you want to give us what you know, but if you are willing to work with us, I will tell you how to give water. Now, that's a really good question. The old man said, I will tell you how to give water, to a person who had no engineering background, no nothing. And there are various documented now stories, and there are wonderful work which Water Stories is going to be presenting in the coming time about how that story of Rajendra evolved into giving water to the villages. But I'll give you a small section of that. He said, come tomorrow, bring a spade and come tomorrow, and I'll tell you, come tomorrow to export. He got a spade, begged around for a spade, and went the next morning. And there was this funny sight of these, children running behind him, and the villagers looking at him very pityingly, saying, "Oh gosh, this is a city lad. He's not going to do any hard work. I wonder what he's going to do." And they followed. And the old man met him in a particular spot in the landscape, and he said, "Start digging." And he started, and don't ask questions. So he didn't ask questions, and he started digging. And he dug, and he dug, and he dug, and didn't get really very far. How much can you get with a spade? But about on the third day or fourth day or something, the old man said, "Right, do you know what you're doing?" And then he explained to him how to read the landscape, and how, where in the landscape could you collect the water. But to collect the water, you need to build an intervention. So where do you build the intervention that would then collect, that would then stop the water from flowing away? And that is when he really understood that it was actually a traditional simple method which the villagers had been practicing for centuries. But with the advent of modern systems, what had happened was that various governments said, "Oh, we'll give you water in a tap." But you can't give water in the tap if there's no water in the ground. And if you don't look after the water in the ground, which unfortunately is what had happened in Rajasthan, then there is no water in the tap. And the old man was giving him a lesson in how traditionally the communities who were illiterate, yet who lived on the land and could read the landscape and the weather and the climate and everything that gives us life so well, how they held water in a dry area. So he dug, and slowly the villagers started joining him, and they got together and they looked, they read the landscape. They have no tools, they have no paper. They have, that generation, few of them were educated. Today, of course, many more, the next generation's been educated. And so their tools were the ground. This was them drawing the landscape in the ground. And you can see over here, that's the catchment, that's the channel where the water is, that's the ridge over there. And that's how they got. And then you can see these are the channels of the water, and that's ash they're using to draw where they can put the intervention. So when the rainwater falls, and as it's going down the slope, it actually gets held over here. And if you do that in successive many of these interventions, then you have a river, the water flowing downstream. And of course, it's going down into the underground aquifer. And that's something which revived the whole understanding of the village, that is something that they can do. And so that's what they did. They started digging. I'm showing you something which was a bigger intervention, but you can make smaller ones. And this is what they did, and that's what they built, and that's how the water got held. You can see that over here. These are two different johats. The structure is called a johat. This one is a slightly more solid one, which is made of stone, and was slightly bigger. It's in the national park, which is right next to the village. But you also get you can make earthen structures, which I'll show you in a minute. So when the rains came, the water got held, and you can see how much water got held. So from a land like this, it became like this. Just look at the difference. This is the same spot. From there, it became green like this when the rains came, when the water got held. And so I told you to hold this picture in your mind. So that was I never fail to say this in any of my presentations, that if you look at this picture, Rajendra's voice was saying, "Do you think that's a road?" That's not a road, that's the dry riverbank. And the work that they did, the villagers did, and that he did with them in 1985. And then this was the same spot a few years later, after all the water was held. So you can see the dramatic difference. When there is water, when there is no water, how dry, how barren life is. And when there is water, how green, how lush, how healthy life can be. That's mustard. Mustard's a very prized plant that's grown in Rajasthan. And so they built not one, not two, but hundreds of such interventions across different catchments. And they revived not one, not two, not three, not four. They revived 7, 8, 9, 10 rivers, and the work continues. And this is communities doing it together. No work was done by Rajendra alone. It was the communities who did the work. They managed the project. They decided that this is part of their work, that this is what, and when they did that, something amazing happened. You know, you own the project. That's your river. That's not the river done by the NGO. That's your river. And when you revive the river and it's your river, you look after it. So you've taken care of an intergenerational problem as well, because, and you're looking after the structures that have been built. So as I said, structures can be very different kinds. I showed you the one that was a very solid one, built of stone and cement. You can have structures, a bunk like this made of mud and stones, and then it gets compacted, so you can have only stones. It depends on the landscape, it depends on the region, it depends on what shape of structure we needed. But these are all community structures. These are all wisdom of the community who know how to read the landscape and who know which structures will hold what amount of water which is relevant to the area. So that was India. And these pictures were taken in 2011 when I first went to visit the project and have a look at the project. These pictures were, from 1985, you can see in 2011 how lush the land is. Life had returned to the village. And with the return of life in the villages, all the young men who had migrated to Jaipur and other cities came back. They said, why, we don't want to live in a city. We're very happy being farmers and in our villages. And that reverse migration took care of that problem of people having to leave their villages for a livelihood and live terrible lives in a city. Instead, come and live lush green lives and do what you know best, which is farming. So it took care of so many problems. And this is happening again and again and again, over and over again. I've put this picture in because this is my most favorite picture of our colleague Chaman Singh. He's the one who manages most of these projects, and the communication with the communities, getting them on board, getting them to say, yes, we will do the work. And he's been doing this work alongside Rajendra and his team for the last 30 years. This is him on a piece of land which had no water, had nothing growing on it for years and years and years. And when the water came back, this was the first crop of wheat. And he's counting the wheat. And then when he counted how many heads of wheat each had, normally a wheat plant will have about 25, 30 heads, and this had 55, the very first crop after the water came back. So lush, so amazing, the abundance that the earth gave once the water came back. So you can see the change in the region over there from 1985 to 2019. Water comes back and the landscape completely changes, and not done by us, done by the community, not done by any particular technologically marvelous intervention, just holding water in the landscape in the shape of what the landscape requires. So water bodies, ponds, these are a huge solution. Restore the water in your landscape, restore the, when you build ponds, what happens is that the water cycle starts coming back into balance. You restore your water cycle and you then start doing something about climate change. So it's the impact on the restoration of water and the water cycle, in regeneration, agriculture, if you want to live in harmony with the earth, if you look at the carbon sequestration, if you look at biodiversity, restoration of water in your landscape, however big or small your pond is, it helps in restoring the balance to the earth. It helps in restoring the amount of carbon. There is a whole load of talk nowadays about carbon sequestration, and there is beginning to be some really interesting data coming out of the amount of carbon that can be stored in ponds. Of course, it depends on different ponds and how much water is coming, but there is very interesting data coming out. It could be a really important natural way of trapping carbon. And there are many more studies, and many citizen scientists are getting into giving us their observations on what happens. So that's about ponds. Retention of water in ponds helps with carbon. I won't go further into it, but what I can now show you very quickly is in Rajasthan, a project that we did in 2019, which we completed in 2019, and Zach visited us. That's the project he mentioned. That was the state of the land. That was the dry water course. And when we went, so that's a drone image of that water course. And then the pond construction, it was actually not even 6 months. The construction itself took 2 or 3 months. And then by the time that was from February till about June, we had to do it before the monsoon came. The villagers, you can't work with mud in the monsoon. The monsoon comes mid-June, and then see the difference that starts to happen. So from July, August onwards, the water started filling in the structure, and then this was what happened by the time it was September. So within 6 months, look at the dramatic change that happened. And the rest you can actually see in that little video, Water for All. It's a 7-minute film. So what actually is the impact of this water coming back? That's a fairly large pond in Rajasthan. And you can see, but you can see the water bank here is actually not that big, and it is mud. Can you build small ponds? So I'll take you to Zimbabwe in Africa. And this is my second hero of the day. There are many others. He's Zephaniah Phiri. Zephaniah Phiri, unfortunately, he passed away in 2015, but he's also called the Waterman of Africa. And he has done enormous, enormous work with traditional community wisdom, rainwater harvesting, and multiple, similar to what I showed you in India, enormous amount of wonderful work in terms of rainwater harvesting has been initiated by Zephaniah with the communities using their traditional wisdom, helping them do more of what they know. And those are the projects, those small projects, the small community projects, and a huge network of those is what really has restored the region over there. Africa doesn't have the same problem as India. The water table in India is all very, very depleted. Africa water table is still quite high, but the surface water in Africa is where the problem is. And the work that Zephaniah and other communities in Africa have done is slowly restoring the surface water that's the communities need. So this one I put, this is in the Chimanimani district, sent to me by colleagues in Zimbabwe. That's the size of the pond they've done, but they do multiple ponds of this size, and the water returns and the greenery returns, and they no longer have to say, oh no, we have to wait for the water tanker, or we have to wait for this. So you saw a huge one in Rajasthan, small one over here, small ones, multiple small ponds sprinkled liberally across the landscape. That's what changes. That's what makes the change. So that's you know, that it's not rocket science. It's so simple. Build ponds. If you can't build them, help somebody build them. Help rural communities come back to balance, building their ponds so their lives in the communities remain lives over there instead of being migrating to a city, putting huge amounts of stress, pressure and stress on the city and the planet itself as well. And in the bargain, not really living healthy lives. I put the next few in that was droughts. This is floods. We have a wonderful project in Slovakia. Another water hero of ours called Michal Kravchik. And he stopped building of a huge dam and helped local villagers build multiple small dams, small leaky log dams, which I'll show you a picture of. And those leaky log dams stopped flooding in all those villages. And you know, this is the kind of landscape there was, and look at the difference that those things have made. You'll see this is a forest. This was a fantastic project Michal initiated, which, you know, in this forest they used the local timber and they built these log dams with the funding that came from the EU was for people who were out of work, and so it was a win-win situation. So you had people, actually local people who were out of work, getting paid to use local materials to stop the flooding in the area. And that was 25 years ago. These pictures I took that 25 years later to show you how lush and how beautiful the area had become. Instead of one smooth, ruined area, it's become completely lush green and holding the water where it is. And then that's the downstream pond 25 years later. So in a flooded area, what are the things you can do in terms of small? And then you have offline ponds in the UK. This is an iconic project over here in Belford. I love this project. My colleagues, Paul, other water heroes, Paul Quinn and Mark Wilkinson, started this project. I'll always remember them telling me that when they went to the farmer and said, look, we can stop your flooding by building these little Johad type things, and we'll hold the water in your field and your other fields won't get flooded. And the farmer said to them, if you do that, I'll eat my hat. And I think he had to eat several hats after that, because the flooding stopped in the Belford burn, which was a 35-mile burn, and a town or village that used to flood 5 times in a year. Actually, just completely, there was no more flooding. And what's more, recently in 2015, when there were, or even 18, there were these massive rains, and there was a sort of a microclimate over there, and so there was no flooding in Belford, while all around there was flooding. So how these small structures can actually, nobody believes the power of these small structures until they see it for themselves. So this is what we call the ditch of the future, staggering the water as it goes downstream. When these pond gets held in these, sorry, I beg your pardon, the water gets held in these small ponds, in these small ditches, it stops the flooding downstream. So there are various small community initiatives that communities around the world, this is in the UK, are actually beginning to adopt to be able to restore their water cycle and restore the health of the water on the land here. That's in the Belford pub. I also had a drink with them once we reached over there, and toasting the fact that they're not flooded anymore. So a lot of our work then became, one is how do we enable these communities to build more ponds? And we've started connecting with lots of local NGOs. We work with local NGOs in different countries and different rural areas to do more of this work. And if they have interesting small methods like Johads, like leaky log dams, and I'll show you a little map of India, how can we share those methods? That was a good question that came to us. So in India, these are just 4. There are many, many different methods in different parts of the country that communities use to hold the water in their landscape. So there's Johads in Rajasthan, there are Har pines in Bihar, there's the contour trenches in Maharashtra, and further down in Tamil Nadu, Zings in Ladakh. And before this wisdom vanishes, if there are successful projects, Slow Partnership as an organization, we put together these methods. We are starting to build a library of language neutral films that these methods can be available to communities across the world and use them as and how they need in their landscape to do the work that they might need to do. So this we've started holding in a library in what we call the Water School. And the Water School has much more than just the films as well, but there's also a lot of background. But these films, as they come up, the language neutral method films will get shared by communities, are already being shared by communities across the world through, nowadays, a lot of people have mobile phones, and in the coming time to come, that will become even more useful. It's held on a platform called Waterways, waterways.world. And so you can go there and have a look at the different methods that are already there, and it's a developing resource and a library for communities across the world. The school is completely free. Whatever is there is there for us to, anybody to use to utilize, to revive the planet. We are so now beginning to develop the Water School, and doing a lot of work already happening in India. We're working with communities in Africa. This is a water map of Africa, and we're beginning to develop a community water map of Africa. What are the different methods that African communities are now using to restore the water in their landscapes? So sand dams is one. The little pond I showed you was built by this community in Zimbabwe, in Chimanimani, and done totally by them. You can support the community water map school in Africa, or you can revive the Pilbara River in Rajasthan, or you can revive ponds that are constructed by us, by our communities across the world. We have a website called the One Pond Fund, so you can go and have a look over there. You have the waterways.world to look at the different methods communities are using to be able to revive. If you have stories or you have methods or that actually can be useful to others, do send them across to us, communicate with us, tell us, and help community-driven decentralized water management happen across the world. Thank you very much. I'm very open to questions, anything that, suggestions, ideas, anything you would like to say, but thank you for your time and attention.
Wow, thanks a ton, Minnie. That was amazing. It's you blitzed through that. There's so many epic projects that, I mean, for one, it's inspiring, it's eye candy. It's just so beautiful seeing all these projects in action and just seeing, especially seeing the befores and afters and their effects on communities. So cool. I'm making sure my internet's stable. And for folks, let's do a little bit of recap for anyone of you who would like to support Minnie's work. Well, she's posted those links below, but I'm going to paste them in the chat box.
One Pond Fund.
Yeah, Flow Partnership and One Pond Fund are some of the best ways that you can help, put these projects in action. And
we might have lost Raleigh there for a minute. Oh,
you got him back.
All right, I'm back. Jeez, what happened there? Sorry, folks. Well, guess I shouldn't have posted that. Well, let me post those links again one more time, and then we can get to some of this Q&A here. Man, you're telling the story of Rajendra, and it's so cool hearing it from your perspective, because we've been making this Rajendra film for the last few months, and it's so great seeing that perspective. And we're looking like, gosh, what does Manu Kaka look like? What is this old man in the village? Seeing that picture.
That was Mangu Kaka's son.
That was Manu Kaka's son. Yeah, but it's great seeing like, that was what he must have looked like. And seeing the river before and after, that was incredible. That's stunning.
I know you said eye candy. Actually, that is really what it is. It is so incredible that from a dry, barren land in 1 month, 3 months later, suddenly you have this. It's just that little bit of imagination, little bit of work, little bit of digging, little bit of holding the water, and suddenly you've got the eye candy of a lush, green, beautiful earth, which feeds you and keeps you alive and healthy. How difficult is it to make that jump? It is not complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Such powerful stuff. And just a brief recap for people, please, if you want to type in your questions, add them to the forums at Water Stories. I just posted a link there. And then if a few people want to ask their questions live, please raise your hand if you want to share your mic and share your video and ask your question live. We'd love to answer a few of those first if people are interested before we dive into the questions on the forum.
Yeah, I'm just reloading here. Great. So we got some questions coming in. Zach, looks like you kind of seeded it.
Yeah, I've been copying and pasting questions that people have already asked in there. So those are
okay, great.
Those are the questions we've gotten so far. Does anyone want to raise their hand and ask a question in person?
Oh, I'm sure a lot of folks do. Let's look at our Q&A here. Yeah, Sonia, Abdullah, a lot of folks raising their hand. Great. Well, why don't we go for the folks on the community who asked a question, then we can go to some of the live questions. For some reason, must be my hotspot, but Zach, do you mind doing the screen share on the Water Stories?
Yeah, sure. Let me pull that up. So one question I know that I was particularly fascinated by was a question from Steve here. And I think Minnie, you could probably speak to this really well. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the following idea. What could be the positive, negatives, and could this happen? I've been thinking lately that it would be beneficial to have a regular international competition that encourages national pride and competitiveness on restoring degraded landscapes. Who can demonstrate the most impressive regeneration results? Baseline land metrics can be recorded. Maybe there are different categories. Who can grow the most nutrient dense food, restore their hydrology, restore the biggest area? I think wealthy individuals and institutions could be excited to compete and have a legacy for their children and their nation. Ultimately, everyone wins. Is this realistic? Do you have any connections that would be interested in coordinating?
Oh, absolutely. No question. Zach, that reminds me of the Water Cup.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to tell people what that is?
I'll say a bit, and then if I miss out something, please add. There's this community in Maharashtra, and actually the Pani Foundation was the organization that did it, and they got together. They are also having the same problem, and you'll see some of their methods. They use contour trenches, continuous contour trenches, which is one of the methods that's there in the water school. But this community went one step further. Not only did they start digging contour trenches, and then they got the various villages to, how do you get the different villages to dig the contour trenches? So they decided to have a water cup, and they held a competition who could get the water back, or who could dig the most contour trenches, or who could restore their landscape, which village could restore their landscape fastest, best, whatever the parameter was. And it created a wave of excitement in the villages. And so every year that competition happens, it's called the Water Cup. So Steve, what could definitely happen with that is we could add in some of the suggestions. You choose the community, you can choose where one would like to, and there would definitely be interest to do something like this. We were already discussing in a community in Zimbabwe, or not Zimbabwe, Mozambique, etc. So this is definitely an idea that could encourage many more people in villages and rural areas to get plugged into this water work. Zach, what would you like to add something there?
Yeah, I just think it's a great way to bring that competitiveness in a really, speaking back to the origin of competition, which is to strive together. And it is something that's got a clearly positive result for everyone involved. And so whether you win or lose, your village benefited, the landscape benefited, the climate benefited. So I love the idea. I know one of my friends has called that Water Cup the biggest water restoration project on earth. And it's really impressive, just bringing that fun game-like aspect to it. I think there's a lot of potential there.
Lot of potential, absolutely. I love those words. It is the idea of competition is to strive together, and it is only when we strive together can these water restoration projects really come into their own.
Yeah, absolutely. A question from Roberto that a couple of people commented on too. Any projects in Eastern Mediterranean, and does this work in Mediterranean climates? How do these techniques work?
One of the things that we found is that each community or each region or each culture has their own traditional ways of holding water and keeping the water in their landscape. So part of our work is uncovering what was the traditional methods in their area. The other side of it is that the work of Johad building that we did in Rajasthan and the language neutral film we made out of it, we really wanted to see the same thing. Does it really work on another part of the planet? So we went all the way across the planet to Colombia and showed it to communities before we finalized it, and had amazingly vibrant discussions with communities over there, whether that they, did they get something out of that? Would they be able to? And the answer came immediately. No, we've got something similar. We got Hawaiis, which we do, which are not very different from Johad's. I mean, that happens in Rajasthan. We've got similar thing here, and this is what we can do. So we are building to, with the community over there, our projects, helping them to build their own traditional wisdom, the Hawaiis. So I'm pretty sure in the Mediterranean, it depends on the landscape. Zach, you might know of projects, but it's essentially The principle is holding water. So whatever the landscape, you can design the structure to hold the water according to the landscape. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I from my perspective, Mediterranean is one of the climates where it works the best. It's one of the climates where it's the most needed. It's one of the climates that's most rapidly desertifying, and it's a very historically agriculturally productive area where that's really coming into risk. And so there's some incredible examples in the Mediterranean of work like this. CEPS projects in Spain, Vivencia de Hisa, the projects in Portugal at Tamera. Now, these aren't Eastern Mediterranean, but it's the same rough climate structure. And even in, the Northwestern US where we work a lot, it's increasingly more like a Mediterranean climate with these really long, hot, dry summers. And when your precipitation and your growing season are at different times of year, it becomes even more critical to hold that water, because otherwise you're just drying out and burning at the time of year where it should be really lush and productive.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, increasingly there's alarm in the media, and you're talking about how Spain and Italy, the olive harvest failed last year. And can you imagine a world without olive oil? I mean, if harvests fail like that, then, and primarily because there's no water, they're becoming drier and drier and harsher. And the solution is so simple. On scale, if you hold the water, that's all the trees need. So of course you can, yeah, I completely agree. The need for, in those regions which are becoming harsh and dry, very simple and easy to do them. It needs will.
Absolutely. And determination. And, that's another thing that we see time and time again is no good deed will go unpunished. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the struggles I know I've heard of in India with these projects where the government sold the fishing rights to some of the water bodies they'd created, and, how these communities really had to band together to get through that litigious hurdle.
Yeah, I mean, in the project I showed you where Rajendra was doing the work, the very first river, which was incidentally called the Arvari River. So after years, almost 30, 40, 50, 60 years of having no river, you saw them all working together, and they revived the river, and finally the water was flowing. It became a perennial river. It was no longer seasonal. And when the river became perennial, the fish came in it. So that was another additional food source for the villages, and everybody was terribly, there were about 80 villages along that river course, and everything was going absolutely fine. Villagers' lives had started happening again until one fine day they saw this government guy coming with a notice from the government. And the notice from the government said, we've noticed that there's a river in your area, and we've also noticed that there are fish in the river. And of course, we hope you are aware that if you are fishing in the river, you need a license. So could you kindly contact us for a fishing license? So I have these amazing pictures. I don't have them here, but this whole, 80 villagers all got together, and there was this consternation amongst them. Where was the government when we didn't have water? They'd given up on us. Our young people had gone to the cities, and we were left for dead. So where was the government when we didn't have water? Now they have no shame to say we need to ask them for a license for our own water, to fish in our own water. The river is ours. That feeling of complete, that ownership, this is ours, we've done it, and that pride. So let's write a reply to the government. So they wrote the reply, and they said, yes, of course, you're totally right. There is a river where there was no river before. There is fish in the river where there were no fish before. But there's only one thing that's wrong in your message, is that it is not we who have to take a license from you to fish. It is you. If you ever decide to give fishing contracts to anybody, you have to ask us before you do that. And this was fantastic. It was called the Arvari River Parliament, the very first river parliament in the world. And it had no legal authority, but it had a huge moral authority. And when the villagers came together with that moral authority, the government had no choice but to listen. Of course, it struggled a bit. back and forth, but eventually the government agreed. We agree, the river is yours, the water is yours, the fish are yours. And if ever any contracts are given, we will take the permission of the River Parliament before we give any contract. So that was a huge victory for the community. Not just did they revive the river, but they also, with their ownership, they also had a moral authority which got the government to see the, what was the right thing to do. So citizen action, it's not always that the governments do the wrong thing. It's also, they're also part of how do you engage them into seeing the right thing. And actions like that, you hear of more and more across the world. In the example I gave you of Slovakia as well, Michal had something similar, and it wasn't about fish, but it was about how he, the water, there was a stormwater damage in a whole park, and how he got the government to engage with them to actually, their organization then really revived that whole section. So it is, when you do the work, then you have the moral authority. If you're sitting and telling people what to do, then of course the government says you're talking too much, go away, we'll talk instead. So it's enabling communities to really take charge and responsibility of the work, which also then gives the moral authority of them having, looking after, being the guardians, custodians, stewards of the earth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is a really relevant question, I think, to your experience in the UK, but also to recent current events. Matthias from Germany. In Germany, we recently had some pretty serious flooding lately. But if you look at the amount of rainfall, it's not so much, to be honest. My impression of it is that Central Europe historically eliminated many water bodies and retention spaces by draining every wetland, and after that, management, in quotes, and industrial agriculture did the rest to produce highly dysfunctional soils with very low infiltration rates and water holding potential. Could you explain a little bit more about how the ponds would be used to reduce the impact of flooding, where they would need to be placed, and if there is a risk of overflowing?
Okay, so I'm not a technical person, but I'll attempt to answer that from the experience I have of the work that's been happening. And Zach, maybe you can come in with the technical bits after. But yes, I agree. If you build ponds in the right spot, and if there are enough number of ponds, for sure that could actually stop that momentum of water going downstream. So usually, upstream is where you build the ponds. And so that the water doesn't become this mass that is rushing downstream, and then what you see that happened in Germany. And you also, looking at the natural contours, is you decide where to site those ponds, and then you site them in the path of the maximum water. Now, in England, one of the places that where I've seen is we also have a lot of natural walking pathways. And in the huge storm or rainfall events, what happens is those become the channels for the water to completely, instead of walking, it's the water rushing down and then gathering momentum and eventually becoming this huge flood downstream. So one of the things that they've done over here is that you have you have the walkway or the walking paths, and then with the walking paths, you also actually do a natural flow for the water to go offline from the path. So then it then gets stored offline and doesn't continue becoming this huge momentum. And that, if if you do that enough number of times over an area, then you are definitely going to make an impact in the amount of water that goes downstream and floods. Can the ponds flood? Yes, of course, the ponds can overflow. So one of the techniques that in one area that I've seen people use is that those staggered ditches. So you have one pond which then overflows into another, which then overflows into another. So there are various different small things you can do, which done sufficiently over enough of an area, which can definitely impact the amount of water that then becomes a flood. Zach, would you like to comment on the technical or anything else?
Yeah, I think, Matthias, you're spot on in terms of your observations that we've drained all of these historical systems that were those shock absorbers. And so really when I look at building a pond, it's not just the water that the pond itself is holding, but it's the water within the landscape that it's holding. And this is where you get these buffering effects, because when the water is a foot above normal level in the pond, it's not all pouring out in the landscape, it's also infiltrating into that higher level of the landscape that it just flooded to. So a lot of this is reconnecting floodwaters with their historic floodplains where they would spread out and bring all of this fertility and bring all of this moisture to the landscape. And so it, I totally agree. I think the rain events as they're happening, the only reason they're destructive is because of our drainage systems concentrating them to these very select pieces. And so it's very important that those water bodies are not, you're not trying to solve the whole problem with one water body. You're trying to create many water bodies so that you're having a lot of soil infiltration going on. And that's what really helps control the flooding. You're setting your spillways up for the biggest flooding event so that overflowing is a normal occurrence that happens. You're not trying to hold every drop of water, but you're trying to shock absorb those big waves of water. And I know a friend of mine, Ben Falk in Vermont, during Hurricane Katrina, which destroyed half of the state, there was a trickle of water flowing out of his place. Everywhere else, it was flooding everywhere. But because he had done a decentralized management landscape with many different water impounding features, the water, clean water, was leaving the bottom of his property and at a small flow rate, whereas every other place had chocolate brown water just flooding into the rivers, destroying infrastructure downstream. And so it's really only with that decentralized technique that you achieve that kind of flood control. If it's centralized, eventually a flood is big enough that it destroys it anyway.
Totally. And another thing I noticed in Scotland is that they have started re-meandering their rivers, the small streams. So in industrial times, they just straightened the rivers just so it was easy to sail the goods down them. And now even the small streams that they straightened are now being re-meandered. So then it actually does stop flooding rather than just becoming this huge mass of.
Yeah, and when I look at waterways, it's just so sad to see them all flowing so much lower than their historical norms, where these waterways have no chance to connect to their floodplain because we've built in the floodplains or we're doing agriculture in the floodplain. So we're dredging the waterways, but we're also lowering the standing water level in the whole landscape when we do that. So it's an immediate fix to flooding that still leads to future flooding, but also leads to the drought. And so it's just a whole new paradigm that's needed. One question that came up a couple of different times was, is the regeneration of these landscapes also moderating temperature?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The temperature, I mean, it's not even, it's common sense. You know, the minute the greenery comes back, and of course, one of the ways to compact the soil with which the earthen bunds are made is you plant trees. And what we are also now encouraging is you plant fruit trees. And those trees not only stop evaporation loss, they give you food, and they cool the temperature. So in extreme heat, you can actually be outside and under the trees and not feel terribly hot. But over and above that, it also lowers the temperature of the region. The more greenery there is, the lesser the temperature. So while it depends, of course, on what's the temperature of the areas. But for sure, the temperature difference is huge between where there is water and there isn't any. Even when you walk along a causeway yourself, you can feel it yourself.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I think your guys' work illustrates so well, and Rajendra's work, and really the work of these communities illustrates so well, is that in 30 years, they've reduced the temperature 2 degrees Celsius. That's incredible within a region like that. You think in 30 years, they've already offset our anticipated warming from climate change. And so it really shows you that if we start working with water, we can actually make a difference very quickly.
Yeah, And I want to add to that, that it took 30 years only because, and this will answer some of the questions I can see here, is that when they started, they had no machines, they had a simple spade. So it took 9 months for a group of villagers to actually dig one water body. Now, of course, you can use diggers. And I had this question in one of the projects that we were doing, and the funds had been raised by the funder, who said, all these big machines, and is there all these poor communities, how do they afford the big machines? And is there a way that they don't, what will communities who don't have the big machines do? And so then the equation is really very simple. Of course, you can dig by hand, but who will pay the people, the communities who leave the farming to come and keep digging the ponds day after day for 9 months? How will they live? Whereas if you raise enough funds to actually help them have a digger, within 3 months, you have what we showed you. So you can have equipment or you can't have equipment. If we want to reduce the temperature by 2 degrees Celsius, if the whole world got together today, I mean, it won't take 30 years. We've got the machines. If we have the money we've got umpteen times over. If you can send people to space, you can definitely put that money on the ground and regenerate degraded landscape. Put all the diggers to work. Within no time, you'll find the global warming scenario that we're looking at will begin to come down. I mean, that's on a huge scale, but it is very clear in areas where this work is done. The temperature does come down, and it's not rocket science. It is absolutely common sense. There's one question here. If the soil is sandy, how to make a dam with locally available material? Also, how to solve water seepage? So one is, you want water seepage in the ponds if you want to recharge the underground aquifer. But the aquifer. But in Africa, if they have only sand, then they make sand dams. So there's no water on the surface, but they work in a particular way where the water is held below the sand, and so it stops evaporation loss. There's a whole technique it's one of the methods that's there in the water school, and when it's needed throughout the year, they can actually take the water out of the sand. So you can, and if you want to build with the you can't really build with sandy, but you can, when you dig it out, you can add other material. You do it with as much local material as possible, but to give it longevity, then you cast your eyes around and see what is available that will help bind the materials that are there and help you create the structure. So in England, you don't use mud, you actually use wood. So you can also use wood. It depends on where you are and what's available.
Nice. So Zach, I'm seeing a few questions about like how people get started with pond building. There's a question from
Yeah.
Gary,
I want to there's one piece I want to add in there too that answers another question. I think it's very fulfilling to create a water body that holds water throughout the year in a dry area. But if your water body does not hold water throughout the entire year, it is even more important to build it. So people always think like, oh, I don't want to build a water body that's not full all the year. But you need it even more if that's the case, because it means your landscape is desiccating so much. There's no flow through it, and you have to store what you have.
Yeah.
So another question people had about evaporative losses. I know in India, that's a big concern, and that's why they're so focused on finding the vertical fractures to infiltrate the water from some of the johads, infiltrate it into the ground, where they can then pull it back from the ground in the dry season. So a lot of times, if you're in a sandy situation with a lot of seepage, your water bodies and retention structures, they may not be johads or ponds on the surface, but they're still accomplishing that groundwater recharge. And you need it even more if it's not possible to build a year-round water body, given your solution and materials you're working with.
And you definitely line, the ponds with trees, looking at the angle of the sun to stop evaporation loss, always. And so those trees fulfill multiple purposes, as I said earlier.
Yeah, and then I think Raleigh, you're pointing out that a lot of people are asking that, and that's a great question as well. I can kind of speak to that first briefly, and then Minnie, if you have any ideas for ways people could volunteer or start to learn this. I think the resource that Minnie is building and Philip with the waterways.world is a very good place as well. And then this resource that Raleigh and I have been working on, Water Stories, sometime towards the end of this year, we'll be launching a course which really provides all of the training to get started with your own projects, starting on a small scale, but it's going to be very activity oriented, where we work people through a lot of exercises so that at the end of that course, they feel like they have the learning, not just in their head, but in their hands. They actually can physically do these things because they're all very simple, but until you actually do it, it's hard to rationalize and understand how to do it and where to start.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really think that this working, you know, in terms of making this knowledge available, in terms of making the practical knowledge available, that in the course that you're planning, that is crucial knowledge. That is the only knowledge you actually need to be able to do the work yourself. And we always say that with the knowledge, you also, you know, sometimes there are communities that don't have the resources. So we've set up the One Pond Fund primarily for that. If you want to put up your projects and you want to, you know, be able to resource them, or as a community that, so then you close the loop. You can actually do the ponds, you know what to do, and you know how to resource them. So that's all in the development. You know, with Water Stories, with the Flow Partnership, we are slowly, within the next few months, you will have a set of tools that will enable you to do the work that could be done.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I guess like that's a good intro for how you get started. I mean, it really reflects on Rajendra's path, right? Like he was a doctor in Delhi who came out to Gopalpura, and he didn't know where to start, but he started the project. He wasn't an expert when he started, but him and this old man were the first people in the village to start this project. And that kind of reflects the journey that so many other people are at, whether you're in a city, whether you're in a small town. You have to start the momentum on these community projects. You know, that it kind of goes into, Yamin Paulson asked this question: how do we start this in a small suburb? I live in a small town in Southern California, and we were running out of water. We rely on water from a small dam that's 37% full. How do we get our town to start a project like this? How can a community start this when we don't own the land where the dry rivers lie?
Okay, I have an example for that. We have this wonderful group from Colombia in Barichara that is actually, they approached us with exactly the same questions. What do we do? You know, we've seen the work you guys do. Can we do this here? And the first place to start is to map your area, to understand your area, to understand what is needed. It's possible joeherds aren't the right thing. It's possible that there might have been something that was already existing, which might be in ruins and could be repaired. What was the way the water in the area was there before? And if there wasn't, what you study what is needed in that area. And you start engaging your community if there is a problem. And your community includes your local municipality, your local government officials, and they usually have a budget as well. So they usually have hydrologists, or you know, they can connect to local hydrologists. They might be corrupt, but then there'll be others in the community who aren't corrupt. So you slowly build. It takes time. That is the hardest part of the work. The work itself is not difficult, but as a community, if you come together slowly building the network and the connections, and then you do the work, then the whole community does eventually come on board. And I've seen this time and time again in different countries, different communities, different rural areas. The hard work is in understanding what is needed in your area and knitting the community together. Put in that time, and when the work actually happens, the right work will happen.
Yeah, that seems to be the struggle of a lot of folks, especially
Even
in
in Rajasthan.
California. Oh, even
Yeah.
Rajasthan.
Yeah, I mean, when we did the work in 2019, which I showed you, the back end, we may have started the actual building and construction, etc., in February, but the back end of that started about 8 months ago. So there, we went to many meetings, and Chaman Singh and other friends went from village to village to village, you know, to actually talk to people, sit, talk, ask, what's the problem? How can you help? How do you want to engage? You know, every one of the, rules, in a sense, was that every household in the village contributes something. So if you do, most of them don't have any money, but what can you contribute? You can contribute time, you can contribute labor, you can contribute materials if you're a farmer. So when you come together and you contribute together and you do what is needed in the area, then the situation changes at some point.
Yeah, and I think we're at this time where humanity has really lost its way and it's lost its sanity. And this kind of speaks to Corey's question as well. How do we get the community to support? He has an example of he built a couple of micro swales on his property and his neighbors all think he's crazy.
Oh, that's good.
And I think we're at this point where we really need to all become advocates for water. We need to part do the work ourselves and part outreach to others and help them understand the solutions are all out there. The answers to all of our questions are available. We just need to start working in the right direction and sharing the right information with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Network, and we are in a connected world. That's the joy of technology, no? That today we are here, all of us together, gathered in this room from different parts of the world. We're connected, we can share, we can exchange, you know, and that's the reason for setting up Water Stories, those inspirational stories of the tools, the methods of how you can do this work, the work that Zach's been doing across the world, the work, you know, the communities that are available on Waterways. This is that online sharing which inspires and enables you to do the work that you can do in your communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it speaks to all these different issues. Another question here about fire prevention. In Cyprus, we had fire 2 weeks ago that burned 55 kilometers squared in an afternoon. How can we retard the fire in the dry season? Have building ponds shown these benefits? And I have a lot of examples there. I'm sure you can speak to it too, Minnie.
No, Zach, go ahead. I was just thinking, do I know of many? No, please go ahead.
You know, one example in California, we did a project in Malibu. Everything we did was illegal, so we can't really say where it was or make films about this. When the fire came through, the neighbors on all sides, ashes, burned up, gone. This property was entirely saved by the work we did because we had infiltrated enough water into the ground and we had hydrated the ground enough and we had vegetation that was still green. So when the fire started to burn into it, the green vegetation retarded the fire and saved it. Almost, you know, it burned a little bit over the property lines, but it almost stopped at the property line. But then there, after the landscape burns, it's the chaparral that becomes hydrophobic. And so it actually liquefies afterwards and forms all these mudslides, which then those retention bodies caught all of those mudslides. And so it's too, you know, it saved the house twice with the work that we did from this one natural disaster. And then there's great examples in Australia where, again, storing water in the landscape, growing the vegetation, and then even cultivating certain types of vegetation, like, for example, willows, retard a fire more than a fire truck does. And so another friend of mine, Peter Marshall, he had the fire burn around him for 2 months in Braidwood, continue trying to enter at different parts of his property. And he was taking crown fires where the whole crown of the tree was on fire to ground fires and putting them out with a shovel. And again, all of his neighbors' ashes, yet he survived the fires without any coming through. And it was, you know, he's paid $1 million in fines for having these willow trees because they're invasive species. Yet the willow trees saved his property, saved the animals, saved the wildlife, saved everything that was there.
Yeah, one of Warren Brush's old farms, Quail Springs in Southern California by Santa Barbara, where there was that massive Santa Barbara fire. It survived while a lot of the other areas were in ashes. And I think part of that's because of the tremendous land transformation work and the few ponds they had. Well, they had one small pond on the landscape, but they also spent a lot of time like clearing the land and putting in kind of agroforestry setups there.
Mm. Mm.
It seems like this is a really common question for a lot of people in the Western world. Like we're making a film on Sepp Holzer that goes into a lot of his frustration dealing with the government and all this bureaucracy that prevents people from doing the right decentralized water retention work. And so here's a follow-up question from Sonia. How do you deal with municipal and national bureaucracy that stops you from doing earthworks, especially gathering water in the landscape? Everything needs a permit. There are fees to pay, projects to present, and wait to see approval. Do you provide some sort of legal speak or ideas to work around problems like this?
I'm afraid we don't, but what we can say is that, I mean, just like Zach said, a lot of the work is you do the work and then get the permission later, you know, and once it's there, then it's harder to not give permission for it because it's common sense. But as long as it's done on your land, I mean, if you can't do it on common land. That you know, sometimes you can. In some areas, you can, and we do. The one thing that I found quite helpful, especially in India, is understanding that you know, those bureaucrats actually do live in the village too, so they too face the same problem, or finding the government official who lives around in the area, and then it's just a process of actually constant talking and finding out what are the loopholes or what is it that you need to fulfill. So I mean, that problem sort of comes, I think, in the UK as well. You just have so many safeguards, as the government calls them, that it's very hard to do something you know, without planning permission. But you know, and each area, each country, each region has their own different laws. So I'm afraid there is no international one sort of a formula that could work. The only formula really is do your groundwork and keep at it. Keep stubbornly, keep consistently chasing what your end goal is, and keep uncovering what are the routes to it. So, and sometimes it's you know, to use a water analogy, it just feels as if it's all stuck, it's all dammed up. But then sometimes you just find that little pin and you pull it out and the waters rush through, literally. So suddenly there's a light bulb that opens, and then the whole government machinery comes and helps you. And I've seen that actually happen as well. You know, so we're all human. The bureaucracy is a human being. He or she, it's their job, and yet they are human too. So it's also bringing that human element in. You know, and nobody wants to live in areas which are flooded, so they too would face that problem. So it's yeah, it's a consistent chasing of the goal you have.
Yeah, and there's two different strategies that I've really seen be effective, and they are very different. I think they suit different people and what they're looking to do. One strategy that, and I think, Minnie, you were really hitting it on the head, as far as these bureaucrats are people. They're people just like you and I. And generally, people who take on roles like that actually want to do something beneficial for the community. They're trying to be helpful. What they don't want is to get in trouble and to put themselves on the line to give approval for this project that they have no idea what's going to happen and what the result is going to be. So oftentimes anything new, they say, no, you can't do that because I don't want to get in trouble, essentially. And so I think one approach is really making connections with those people, really being open with them and saying, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and also calling the child by the right name. Every place has different words for different things. For example, in Canada, a dugout you can build easily without permitting. A pond, you cannot build easily without permitting. And so what you call it depends on how that regulator is going to regulate it. And so finding out what things are allowed, in some cases, for example, in the state of Oregon, you're not allowed to hold any water other than what hits your roof, unless if it is for erosion control and improving the quality of the water. So if you are doing those two things, that gives you a legal framework to work within. So finding the threads that you can pull. And then the other approach that is just as effective, though may result in a lot more headache, is to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. And as Sepp says, follow the laws of nature. Don't follow the laws of man. The laws of man that are in concurrence with the laws of nature, I don't follow those. And so it very much, you can move your project forward, go ahead and do the work, do it quickly before anyone can complain, complete the work. If no one complains, you're okay. If someone complains, you tie it up for as long as you can, and then you submit what you've done as evidence. And Sepp says this, and I believe this of most of the world: no court is going to rule against someone making a beautiful natural oasis. It makes sense to anybody. And so if you can get it to that point, you're going to be fairly safe in most situations. Now, of course, I'm not a lawyer, not giving legal advice, but we are in this very broken legal system, particularly around water, that makes it difficult to navigate. And this is also part of why we're creating water stories and why Minnie's creating waterways, so that we can get the information out there to enough people that the people pressure the government to change, and we get some more sensible ways of managing water and landscape in place.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, we were recently in Scotland, and a colleague of ours has been working with communities, small communities, where actually vested interests like a supermarket has actually taken over the water meadow, and so now, of course, the town floods, and nobody's going to listen, and even the town council actually can't do anything because it's come from up on high. Now that can be very demoralizing and very dispiriting, that everybody knows what needs to happen, and yet something, some higher authority has given the go ahead. What do you do in such a case? So the point, the point that our colleague was making is that what we then do as a community is keep talking and keep seeing where, like water, we can flow to actually make our point and our community need heard. So don't feel dispirited. You just have to keep hacking away. You have to be, if from the group, if the group were 20 when you began, and with all this happening, it becomes 3, but still keep at it. And eventually, the problem does become clear, and somebody has to solve it. And then they come back to you because you have the wherewithal to be able to get the community to support it. So it's hard work. There's no one person can give a solution. It is work we all have to do. It's and we often get suggestions that you should do this. And of course, some of those suggestions are really, really good. But there is no substitute for local community putting in the hard work they need to and then doing it. They can do it. We can't. You can't change stuff on the planet or the way the planet's functioning unless it's done by this network of myriad of all the people who live on it, doing what they need to do. So the tools we are producing, or the stories that inspire us, that we share, are stories that meant to give us the courage and the heart to keep going in the face of bureaucracy or somebody making it difficult for us to do what we need to do.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I think that's where being together in community really helps too, because we can support one another. It's just awesome for me seeing these chats in the comments of just how many people are doing something. And this is the whole idea around water stories. This is the whole idea around waterways, to connect these people so that you all can share ideas and say, I got my pond permitted by calling it a erosion
out.
mitigation basin or whatever it is, so that we can really start to help each other, share information, and all move forward as a result.
I feel like, should we do a little call-in question here?
Yeah, I think if anyone,
Let's do it.
yeah, if people want to.
I noticed that Jama, he's organized all these permaculture conferences, so he's put a lot on he's got his skin in the game, so I'd love to let him answer. And let him ask a question. That's cool. So Jama, I'm gonna unmute you. If you're still there, I'd like to ask your question. So Jay, you there, my man?
Hey, yes. Hey, Raleigh. Thank you. Thank you so
problem.
much for your work. Thank you, Minnie. I'm a huge watershed restoration advocate. And I guess my question for you all and for everyone is, how do we empower this work to the level it needs to be? Like, what kind of existing, you mentioned working with NGOs, and, how can we, what are the strategies of how we can get this funding on a more massive scale? It's wonderful. Yes, it's about the local community level and this kind of work and doing that, but also things are so much easier when you can have some resources. I love some of the examples of, coming in and employing local people. And so I guess that's my question to throw out to everyone is, how do we get this funded in a huge way?
Okay, I'll attempt to answer that. And I know there's a lot more out there in terms of ideas. So one is, when the words crowd fund started, they were really powerful words. So, the challenge we face, because we work with some of the poorest communities on the planet, and you have to keep asking and begging for grants and this and that, and they tell you, what do you mean you're going to restore the water? Better give them a tap instead. So it goes on, and it's sometimes a very relevant questions, and then the grant doesn't come. But the power of the restoration of the planet rests in the hands of the people living on it. So crowdsourcing for ideas, crowdsourcing for resources, crowdsourcing for that impetus, that network. So that's one way we will be able to then cover the planet. If all of us on the planet, or even 80% of us, or even 60% of us did water restoration, did the ponds, the dugouts, the sponges, or whatever they're called, then it would change. So that's the power we need to invoke. So one of the things which we have completely tried to address that question is we are setting up the One Pond Fund, which is an interactive map. You can post your project, you can post what's happening to it. You can, slowly, it's still developing, but you will be able in any part of the world to put up what water body that you want to build, and the impact, what it's going to do, what the structure it'll be, how much water, how much money is needed, and it can directly be a channel to be able to raise funds for yourself. So that's I feel that's where the power of resourcing is. If we keep waiting for those multi-billionaires to really have the light of day, it'll be fantastic when they do, and that's great. And if some of them already do, that's really fab. But it also rests on us. We spread this this whole, put up your projects, talk them, find the sites. One Pond Fund is one site. There are many others. Put your projects out, get people engaged in it. If you can't build the pond yourself, you're living in this one little apartment up there, then find the region of the world, the community in the world that speaks to you, and help them. If they put their ponds up, help them build it. So it's a shared effort that will make this work happen, and it does, and that's been our experience. But there are many other ideas out there, and we're always open to listening. So that's one. It's always, resources are always needed, and it just completely makes me think, how is it that there's money to do things like going up, sending billionaires in space, and there isn't any money for poor people to manage the effects of COVID, just even by like a few pounds. So we need to, there's a mind shift that needs to happen. And if enough people open their hearts and minds, that shift will happen. It'll be unstoppable.
It's pretty inspiring seeing how interconnected networks really can make this happen. Like 2 years ago, we did a webinar with Pleistocene Park and Vice. sent all these documentary crews, probably spent upwards of 60 grand making documentaries for them, but they had a trickle budget, like a few $100s a month, just nothing. But because finally that attention got to them, finally got the Patreon up to like 6,000 a month, which is just it's not a ton, but it's enough to like keep that growing. And I think our interconnected networks can start these crowdfunding campaigns going, like, and it might take time, but eventually we'll get people looking at these projects with serious eyes.
Yeah, and I think
start your own. Yeah, sorry, Jack.
Oh, I think just awareness is the biggest piece. You guys both touched on that, but I find it doesn't matter if people are on the far right, the far left, upside down, wherever. If you describe this in simple language they understand, once they get it, everyone wants to run in this direction. They don't want to just walk. They are just enthralled by it. And it can be really impactful. So it's just about getting the information out there as much as anything. I think people, once they realize we don't have to continue living this watershed death spiral of flood, fire, drought, famine, refugees, migration, we can go in a whole different way. People are all going to start moving that way, whether they're at the bottom of the totem pole or the top of the totem pole. It's really just a question of awareness.
Also, Minnie, the project that you highlighted in your presentation, I think was that in Gopalpur Village, but it was the Rajasthan project where it was in 2019. That what was the cost of that? I remember it wasn't astronomical.
Well, there are two projects. I mean, one is the Pilvar River. There's a whole river, which is a 90-kilometer river, 45 kilometers of which is in almost uninhabited. But there is a whole 45-kilometer section, and I visited it. We've done the whole survey, and it's just completely unbelievable to see how dry those wells are. And if you want to revive that, that's roughly about. We're talking of roughly about 5,000-6,000 families. You're talking of about, I don't remember the figures offhand, it is there on the One Pond Funds High, but you're talking of roughly about 40 to 50 structures that can come up, different kinds of structures, and each one of a different size. So which would take, say, roughly about 3 to 4 to 5 years if you want to revive the whole river. And that would be in the region of about what, $300,000, which is, if you think of it, that impact on a 45 square kilometer stretch, that's nothing to make the region completely lush and green again.
It's like, that's one house, that's one dilapidated, that's a shack in San Francisco. That is a wooden shack in San Francisco, is one river restored in Rajasthan. It's pretty epic, but it's not insurmountable, especially like one of these structures. If it's $10,000 for one of these structures, we could do that. 500 people signed up for this webinar. If 1,000 people saw this, $10, I could fund one of those.
And Minnie, I wonder if you could speak, and maybe you can't for confidentiality, but if you could speak to your guys' partnership with Arup, and just it, as far as the awareness piece, being there with the people involved, I just got the sense that they're going to be in lifelong supporters at their company of the work that you guys do.
Yeah. I mean, it's not confidential. They're some of my most favorite people. I mean, we had their heads, the ones you met, they were heads of their departments, head of the company, managing huge infrastructure, civil engineering projects which we actually know of and have seen huge dams, not dams, railway, bridges, etc. That level of civil engineering. And when we took them to the project that they helped fund, the money part of it, that was in the project that I showed you, and they were very accessible and normal people. So that was the first thing that really warmed me to them. They weren't sitting on a very superior thing. They were normal, wonderful people who completely loved the work of water and loved the earth. And when we went to Rajasthan to see the impact, I was really keen that they come. There was such a resonance that that big infrastructure project that they've helped bring into being, and that little Johad, which the villagers that they've helped bring into being, the principles are the same. And that understanding of those, all that engineering that you study in all your colleges, and yet the simple villager knows. So one of the questions that I loved is our colleague David asked, and wonderful man. He asked the villager, you're digging over here. How do you know how deep to dig? And of course, you have engineers who measure it with this and with that, with the rules and this, and it takes a long time. And then, for me, the most touching and the most beautiful part, and which everybody loved and said the same thing later, is that there was the silence, and the farmer looked at him, and you could see he was thinking in his mind, how do I answer this question? And then after about a minute or so, he just shrugged his shoulders and he said, I just know. And to David's complete credit, he just nodded very wisely and he said, thank you, that's a really good answer. So it is something that is intuitive within us as well. So if we can marry knowledge and intuition, I see that in organizations like Arup, who we partnered with to do this work in India and in Colombia. And so you can be as educated as you like, but when you also use intuition with your education, then you can create magic. And that's that. So for us, a partnership with Arup, who work in 90 countries across the world, has been phenomenal in that bridge between those who are educated in books and those who are educated in the earth, and the bridge between the two, and seeing there's a powerful picture, Zach, we have, all of us sitting on top of the water bank that was built together, and sharing that knowledge and that intuition together. That's what moves the world. That's, that brings us to our shared humanity, not the walls that come with different kinds of superiority of knowledge. So for us, those are the kinds of partners you really want. You want them, you want those who know as well to give of their wisdom to enhance what the villager knows and change the face of the earth from this death spiral, as you said.
Fantastic.
Are there any other people who want to ask the question live? I feel like we're getting to a good wrap-up point, but maybe one or two more if...
Well, there was Diego. He's been on. He might want to ask something. Then Poyam, Riles, Jen. Oh, this is tough. I have to choose. I have to choose a person. How about Jen? Jen, I'm going to let you talk here. Okay. Hey there, Jen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this incredible presentation. I'm so inspired. I'm going to cry. So I have a dream that I wanted to share with you all and actually just present as to get feedback if it's a good idea. But I'm in Southern California. I'm in Los Angeles, and I've wanted to organize like an in-person expo, not just of water, but of everyone working in this general realm of working towards healthier relationship with our planet. And the reason I feel like, everything that happens on this call and other calls like it is so amazing. And for all of us to just be in the same virtual room at once is so beautiful. And I think what would be a logical next step for me is like people physically coming together with booths and tables in this traditional way. And we meet each other, physically in person and share business cards and just having just this network of this plethora of like everyone working in these fields together, in different ways. And yeah, I'm just curious, does that seem like a good idea from where all of you are sitting? And is a in-person conference like a good next step for us to all work together and be pushing this, it's like if we have a car that's out of, we're trying to push a dead engine car, we all need to push it at the same time, like count 1, 2, 3, go. And for me, I feel like that's what would happen if we have more in-person meetings and really know each other person to person.
Raleigh, Zach?
Yeah,
Did you
I
wanna go?
think absolutely. I know a lot of those events have been the more impactful in my life. And the very event that set me on this path was essentially that same thing. And then I would add one layer to that even that I think is really impactful. If everyone is on the ground together working on a shared project that's a shared vision as part of an information exchange, then it takes on this even next level role, because it's not just about coming and sharing what we're doing, but it's also about doing something together in community that we all believe in. So I think a fantastic idea. I'd certainly love to attend. And from my experience, I think it could even add another layer of connection to also have a collaborative action project that's a piece of the expo.
Yeah, I mean, there's been events like, Permaculture Voices was life-changing for so many people who attended. Like it cost the organizer Diego Footer, it was a pretty big sacrifice for him, but it created this wave of people who worked with each other for the rest of their lives. And I know there's workshops that create the same level of people. I know we're all like craving in-person connection, but I've been like one of the best ones I've ever gone to besides Permaculture Voices is just the Quivera Coalition had river restoration workshops where they'd gather and have a group of volunteers there for 4 days to help restore these river waterways with beaver analogs, basically like logs to help increase the water table with water steps. And just being a part of that for 4 days was incredible. People just donated their time. You kind of felt like you were a part of something. You learned a lot. And I think in-person action events as well as workshops are some of the things that I crave the most. And I know in Southern California, there's probably enormous potential for what can be done for restoring rivers in LA and other places.
I want to address one of the points that is often made about in-person conferences is that, oh, there's so much conferencing and flying around and, carbon footprint and everything. And that's absolutely right. And of course, then if you're going to a conference to different ends of the earth every week, you definitely have to look at your carbon footprint. There's no, that's not meaningful. But however, there is a complete, Jean, I agree with you, Jen, that there is a value that comes in the physical meeting of somebody, in the physical being in a space that is it is indescribable. You cannot describe it in words. You cannot have it on digital. You have to, it comes to you when you are a group of people with a shared common purpose. So, but that doesn't mean, so there are two things in that. One is choose the conferences you go to wisely. Give yourself a limit. Maybe it's just that one conference you go to in the year, or maybe two, or it's your limit. You decide what kind of life you're leading and how much carbon you can afford to spend, or the value of that particular conference to the work you will then do. So so you can have a mix of online and you can have a mix of in person. And then of course within your area there are many people who are really skilled in the very issues that you are exploring. And so it could be that a whole new gathering of people also join in to help you create a momentum towards dealing and solving the issues that your conference is discovering. So it has to be a balance. I think just saying completely that in person, no, but it has to be a balance between how many you can do, how local can you remain, how slow can you go to it. I loved that Greta Thunberg went sailing across the Atlantic. All of us can't do it. I definitely can't. I'd probably completely puke my entire way through the whole 2 weeks. But there might be other ways. So it's choose it and plan it and attend wisely, and then decide, do I really need to go? And if you do and do it without guilt, because you know that you will use it wisely.
Yeah, and you don't have to fly across the world to do these. Like J Market organized NorCal Permaculture Convergence. I went to that for about 3 years. That was incredible. Great, like cross California event, and just beautiful. Like these could be self-organized. They don't have to be these massive, like global permaculture conferences that are 10 days long. They can, they can just be local. I think workshops and smaller events are incredibly meaningful. All right, I know we're butting up on our time here. I kind of feel bad. I cut off Diego before he can answer this question. Let's do one last question, then we'll end this. Are you cool with that, Minnie? Or is it too late?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, this is something we can go on all night long and I wouldn't get tired.
Awesome.
But we have to draw a line somewhere.
Oh yeah, we will. One last question. So Diego, you're live.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience, Minnie, Raleigh, and Zach. My question is pretty simple, actually. Have you ever done something like this? We are in a critical situation in my country. We have Mediterranean climate in the central zone, but also in the south, where Valdivian temperate rainforest maintain life in the country is going in a critical situation. My question is for a country, and also with the map you showed, Minnie, Chile is in a really red situation. So for a country with lots of coast and droughts, is it useful to desalinate water and build ponds to regenerate soils and forests? Have you ever done that before, or?
I've never done desalination before, and I haven't had the opportunity to actually go to a desalination plant and see the kind of sludge that comes out after desalinating and what happens to that. So I'm afraid I'm not very qualified to answer your question, Diego, but maybe Zach and Rolly, you might have something to share?
Yeah, a couple of pieces on that. The desalination that I'm familiar with is very energy intensive, and two, you do have this salt brine that you then have to do something with, and typically causes other issues in other parts of the system. There is new technology potentially coming with the new stuff around the fourth phase of liquid crystalline water, and new filters that could potentially, in a very low energy means, distill salt water. But I think that's a more complicated way than it needs to be, in the sense of we have this giant orb in the sky that is constantly desalinating water.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's more, and this brings up the good point too, that half of our precipitation is from water that's locally transpired or evaporated. So when, after 1,000 to 10,000 years of draining away the water, we actually receive less rain at certain times because of that. So as it's a more long-term approach, but as we take that rain, hold it into the water, we're then also increasing our rain by feeding that small water cycle. So there may be some changes in the future that make desalination more of an ecological possibility. But what I'm familiar with now, it provides its own hurdles and challenges that no one has good, clear solutions for yet.
Yeah.
I want to add something about anything which is huge and gigantic, man-made. I am always in favor of small is beautiful. So if it's community size, small size, what is needed in the community. So you don't need these huge, giant desalination plants.
Absolutely.
So come small.
Yeah, no, absolutely. My question comes, for me, I think the same as you, going local and of course desalination, even in a country in Chile, it's more cost not efficient. However, how do you do it when there's no rain at all?
How do you do it when there's no rain at all?
Yeah, and rivers are really dry. So I'm 30 years old, and I've seen, because this is not high extreme risk of drought. It's actually there's no risk. It's happening now. So
yeah, I saw Zach's eyes light up. Zach.
Yeah. Now, when you say you have no rain, what kind of millimeters or inches are we talking about?
Well, in the place I'm living now, there's plenty of rain because it's in the south.
Mhm.
But if you go a little bit north, like in the coast region, you have more fog than rain. So maybe it could be like 60, maybe 100 millimeters per year, 60 millimeters per year in some
Mhm.
places. In other places, just in the desert, it's like maybe 2 or 5. It's nothing.
Yep, and like in the Atacama.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's you know, Rajasthan is about 200 millimeters to give you a
Mm-hmm.
reference. I think there's two different ways to look at it. Every place gets rain at points typically. Now, the other piece that's at play here is whenever you have moisture moving through the air and not falling as rain, that means the nuclei, the precipitation nuclei cycle has been disturbed. And by restoring trees, we could then start to seed the atmosphere with more hygroscopic microorganisms to turn
Mhm.
that water vapor into rain. So if there's water vapor moving through the air, that's something we can design ecological systems to harvest and to turn into rain. And if it's in such a dry place that there's none of that, you really have to start to work from the margins. So for example, a
Yeah.
situation like the Atacama, I wouldn't try and go straight into the middle of the Atacama and do something. I would work in from the margins of the desert and try and shrink the desert from the sides, essentially.
Yeah, I want to add to that about this story of another wonderful water hero, a man called Yakuba Savadogo, and there was a film made on him called The Man Who Stopped the Desert. So it actually, what a wonderful man. In that very desert life where there was not any rain at all, he revived a traditional system called Zai. You know, he revived this whole, I think it was, I saw this film a while ago, about 2,000 meters or some fairly decent size with where there were no trees. You know, they revived these trees, and how he got his community to get behind him, and how he showed them patiently how to capture even that little one drop of water under the leaf, and then slowly what was very interesting was that once the area was revived and the trees came back, guess what happened? The real estate developers came and wanted to buy the whole area, cut down the trees and build these beautiful. It's a brilliant film, The Man Who Stopped the Desert, and it was so inspirational, you know, of how you can actually, where there seems to be nothing, how you can suddenly turn it into something. So, and the
I
man's
really
name
appreciate
is
it. Thank you.
Yakuba Savadogo.
Yeah, I already searched it. Thank you very much, Mini.
At
Thank you
the end to
for
that
your
story
advices.
was that Yakuba then successfully crowdfunded and made sure that that land didn't get sold off to the developers. They were able to do something with it. So
yeah, it's pretty cool addendum to that story.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Thank you, guys. I appreciate the opportunity for a conversation.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks for the great question.
Yeah, thanks, Diego. All right, y'all. Well, oh, Jacob, we'll send you. It's The Man Who Stopped the Desert. Hopefully that's on YouTube. All right.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Well, thanks for joining this fantastic webinar. Minnie, you just blew everyone's minds. And I hope everyone who's a part of this, please, if you want to help Minnie's work, we'll replace those links. You know, visit One Pond Fund, visit the Flow Partnership and the Waterways School. And if you got anything, you feel like inspired, you know, donate what you feel like you can donate, because you know, it's amazing what they're doing with just a pretty small amount of funding, the amount that they can do with just what we can donate as a community. Like maybe we can fund one water catchment project pretty easily. We could definitely do that. And for folks who want to join us for more webinars and join our course when we want to do that, keep your eyes peeled at Water Stories. The link there, I'm posting it, is waterstories.app, because we'll be launching more stuff. We're going to be releasing a film on Rajendra Singh, and eventually another film on Minnie and Flow Partnership, and definitely one on SEP in the future. So definitely keep your eyes peeled, because we'll have a lot in store in the future. So thanks everyone for being a part of this.
Thank you for patiently and for all the discussion is always very illuminating, and it's very useful to everybody, including us if we are working on the ground, what comes out of this is what then gets translated into the work on the ground. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Zach and Rolly, for all the work you guys do and enable with us and others.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you
for
so much,
joining
Minnie,
us.
for joining us and for doing what you do. And yeah, just being such a light in the world for water. And thank you everyone who's here for joining us. You know, we have to do this together. So it's
totally.
You're all chipping in.
And one last note, yeah, we're going to send a replay email after this. It's going to live on the Water Stories community and the Water Stories YouTube page, and we'll have follow-up questions there. So thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Stay well.